Last week's Supreme Court ruling that struck down the use of race for affirmative action programs in higher ed has us wondering, what is up with Black and Asian relationships? We're going to talk about it on today's Freedom Friday.
It is Freedom Friday, and you are still not free.
Welcome, friends and family. It's another episode of Freedom Friday, and you are still not free. But hopefully you will be freer after this hour with Sharif, El Mekki, and me. Good to see you all. We're going to have a very important topic today. We're talking about the state of Asian and Black relationships, and it comes in the aftermath of the Supreme Court's ruling on affirmative action, actually striking it down. If you're not familiar with the case, that case was brought by Students for Fair Admissions, and it was against Harvard University and one public college. It's escaping my mind right now. And it really rested on two questions. One of the questions was around whether or not they could overrule a previous case that allowed for the use of race in admissions, in college admissions. And the second one revolved around kind of like whether or not the current system was penalizing Asians specifically. And this SCOTUS ruling, of course, has had a lot of fallout. There's a lot of conversations that have been had about it. I'm seeing a lot in the media around this question that is kind of like this was a foregone conclusion. This was going to happen at some point. It's just been, there's kind of like a conventional wisdom that this has just been unfair to Asian kids. And that's a lot of the narrative. What I haven't heard a lot about is why are we comparing Asian kids and Black kids as if they're apples to apples and using the model minority myth. When we think about college admissions and we think about creating diversity in college and universities, we think a lot about the fact that not everybody is starting from the same starting point. But when it comes to Asians and Black, we pretend as if those students are starting from the same starting point, and one group, just through sheer hard work and, kind of cultural supremacy, is doing better than the other group. That's not research-based. But we're going to talk about it today. Sharif, how you doing, man?
Good, man. Doing well. Good morning. Good morning. Happy July.
I don't know what that is.
that's for the July 4th of Independence Day. You lie.
You lie. The 4th of July. Independence from who? For what?
Exactly. But no, good to see you, man. Good to see you. And yeah, this the whole SCOTUS, conversation has been going on. And it reminds you, like, when people might have gotten distracted about the importance of voting, right? And we know that we're seeing this is a long arc, and it's going to continue because a lot of these judges that were appointed are lifelong judges. Like, they leave when they want to leave or when they're just drop dead. So, like, it's not just Supreme Court either. It's the federal courts. And I forgot how many Trump had actually got in placement. And we saw some of the ramifications when Reagan, put a bunch of folks on. And so we see this, and we'll continue seeing it. I don't think they're done, man. No, I don't think they're done.
What this raises for me is a question just a little bit about history that gets us up to speed. In the 1960s and the 70s, America was very much a Black-white country. When we talked about civil rights and we talked about needing for racial progress, we were talking very much in terms of historically marginalized populations, specifically those that were descendants of slaves and slavery. And that, because of that, it was a very color-coded conversation that was between Black and white. What happened after 1964 and the changes to the immigration laws is that the racial quotas on who could enter the country changed because of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that Black people were so instrumental in passing. One of the groups that benefited greatly from that are Asian Americans. Asian Americans doubled in the last 2 years, I think, or I'm sorry, last 10 years. But between 1964 and now, they rapidly increased in a way that they hadn't before those changes were made to the immigration system. One very important fact to get across: that group of Asian Americans who came in were on average more educated than their peers where they came from. And they were coming from a higher socioeconomic bracket where they came from than their peers there. And there's something called hyperselectivity, which means the United States, when they changed the racial quotas, they also upped the ante on who could get in. They just didn't open the door and let a bunch of people of color in. They actually started changing the rules a little bit about who can get here. So when we talk about why do Nigerians do so much better than, foundational Black Americans? Why do Asians do so much better? Well, we have to talk about the fact of how they were selected to come here. And when we talk about Asian Americans, we're not talking about one group. We're talking about a lot of different groups. There's a big difference between Chinese Americans, Hmong Americans, Japanese Americans, and Indian Americans, and their progress here in the United States. So when we ask this question around, should colleges still be honoring what was a long-term commitment to opening doors specifically for African Americans to go to elite colleges and universities? One, because they offer something unique to be there for the whole community because they're trying to educate tomorrow's leaders. And two, because that's a long-standing commitment that has been made to African Americans. So no new group should come along and try to, like, African Americans shouldn't go look at Indian treaties and say that's
Why y'all got that? Uh-oh. Yeah, I can't hear you. It shows up that you're muted on mine, but I think one of the things that interests me in this whole piece is exactly what you said, Chris, that people should not, if you're not connected to history, if you have a misunderstanding of history, if you get to the States, and this doesn't matter like who it is, right? Because I see this from Nigerians. It's in the media. I'm hearing of it from Asians. I've heard it directly from people of the African diaspora, whether it's the Caribbean or elsewhere. Certainly hear it from European immigrants, Asian immigrants. Like, if you come here and you're disconnected to history, or your only grounding in the context of America is on the media, the news, social media, that's extremely problematic for you having a miscalculation of like what's actually happening. What are the politics? What's the history? And how are all these things connected? Even when you think about, so in Philadelphia, we have a growing Asian population. And when you see students, right, like it's students in particular schools, when they're all lumped into Asians, and what a friend of mine would say, like, hey, darker Asians, and I don't know, like all the nuances of the different orgs, but they said like there's a group that's may not necessarily be looked at as the model immigrant from the lens that it's typically looked at, when you're talking about the Hmong or the Vietnamese or other groups, because it almost comes at like your story as you come here, as you go anywhere, but as your story is, how did you get here? Why did you come here? And what's the context and the conditions? Were you hired as a doctor and an engineer and you came? Did you come in through a university basis? Were you a refugee? Were you from a war-torn country? And that is what allowed you to come through more of a refugee status as opposed to a professional doctor, engineer, etc. In the space. And like, how does that draw into the equation? We see that sometimes with students when they we're wondering, well, how come this Asian student, anytime you're comparing anybody, you shouldn't compare siblings, right? Comparing siblings is a bad thing, let alone comparing other groups of folks without context and understanding of like what's happening. And this is going to continue because America has broken so many promises. That means those things, it doesn't just end, right? Like that broken promise has legacy. It has progeny, and the progeny of it all The progeny of it all means that the broken promises compound. So when you say, yes, we're going to provide reconstruction and try to readjust how society has been built, but only do it half-heartedly, and even then continuing to bake other things in, and then quickly abandoning it to gain more political power. When you promise 40 acres and a mule, land and opportunity to develop that land, and then you renege on that promise. When you promise on civil rights and human rights, and then renege on that promise, those continue. So that means there's going to be legacies continuing to be built, continue to be compounded on these particular issues, and it will keep revisiting some of these same things. And you look at it and you base it and say, like, you know what, this is still the history of this country. And the original sin was racism, was enslavement. And as long as you have that and you've not dealt with the original sin of this country, the tributaries from that original place is going to continue. There's no stopping it, right? Like a force in motion doesn't stop. You know what I mean? It continues until there's been a very direct, distinct change. Oh, it sounds like you're back, Chris.
I'm back. Yeah.
All right,
so
cool.
Let me say this. First of all, we need to point out a couple of points. Number one, the majority of Asian Americans support affirmative action.
Yes.
And so we're not talking as if we're like fighting. There's no group of people here, and to that point, I think we have to point out that these are stories that are used on purpose to divide us.
Oh yeah.
Right. So this
100%.
affirmative action case did not come out of thin air, and it was meant to divide us on purpose. Right. And we're playing along with it. We're allowing others to play us on it. I just want to show you. I wrote something this week about it's about more than affirmative action. There's a guy named Edward Bloom, who is the person who brought the Abigail Fisher case, and I wrote about this week. If you don't remember, Abigail Fisher was the white girl in Texas who sued the state system, the state college system in Texas, because she said that lesser qualified people of color were getting in, and the only reason she didn't get in was the color of her skin. That case failed. Number one, that case failed because it was a lie. It was untrue. She actually did not have good enough stats to get in. First,
she said, "I'm white."
Yeah,
that's good enough.
And she's just like, and it's funny because Edward Bloom, who is the guy who has been bringing these cases that challenge all racial reparative laws and rules for years, he's had success at this. He's a guy in Texas who ran for Congress, and when he lost, he got mad because he said his loss was based upon gerrymandering in favor of Black voters, and he sued on that, and he won, and that became his career. After that, he's been planting these kind of anti-racial reparative law challenges for years now. And the Abigail Fisher one failed because it was a white girl. This is his thinking. There's video clips of him talking to an Asian American group in Texas, saying to them, "I need Asian plaintiffs." He's being very specific to them, and he's making a case to them that they would get an advantage out of this if they could find him some plaintiffs. He was plaintiff shopping. He wasn't doing a very good job of plaintiff shopping, so he created this organization that sued and got the organization standing, Students for Fair Admissions. And part of that was so that we could not know who the plaintiffs actually are. And it's because they were immaterial, really, to the case. The case wasn't even really about them. The case was really about ending racially reparative laws and rules, specifically in college and universities. What's so important about this, though, is no matter what lawsuit you bring, you will find your plaintiffs, and they don't have to be representative of their group at all. Like I said, the majority of Asian Americans are not falling for the bait taken here, and many of them can see this for what it is. But no one is talking about it that way. We're talking about it as if it's just a legitimate legal case that was brought just for kind of on face value, legitimate reasons, when in fact, this case was funded by very conservative think tanks through this guy who has made a career at beating up on racially reparative laws and rules. So if we know that as background, why should we treat this issue as if it's just a Supreme Court case? That's one of my questions. And also, Sharif, I want to ask you a deeper question on this. What does it say about our Constitution and the United States Constitution, the constitutional thinking, that the Civil Rights Act, which was passed specifically to address what Black people were going through, could be used against us to end the programs that came out of the Civil Rights Act?
Mm-hmm.
This is the same Constitution that made Dred Scott okay. This is the same Constitution that made Plessy versus Ferguson okay. This is the same Constitution that has erased all of our rights during different periods of time. So where everybody just spent the 4th of July with their fireworks and rah-rah and all of that type of stuff. Oh my God, look at me. I'm American, wearing their American underwear and everything, which, by the way, is against the rules. I want y'all to know, stop wearing flags. It's totally against the damn rules. Stop doing it. Your flag t-shirts and all that. Made in China too, by the way. Anyways, that's an aside. What does that tell us as Black people about how we should view the Constitution, that it could be used against us even for the gains that we've already made?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and it should consistently get a side eye, because the whole idea that this is a infallible document, when we know the history of the people who wrote it, right? Like, to me, that's the most mind-boggling thing, that here are these imperfect people who wrote a perfect document, and then other people with similar mindsets, even if they, as their originators, are to be trusted to interpret it for the good of humanity. Like, it none of it makes sense, right? And there are certain things about the Constitution that should be reviewed and repealed, and that is not popular in America, because they look at this as some type of golden, heavenly sent document, and I'm just like, it was crafted by a bunch of racists. A bunch of racists and perverts came together and drank and crafted something. And yeah, not to mean that they weren't smart people, but Dr. King wrote in his thesis when he was 15-year-olds that it's character plus the content, right? Like, it's who you are, what's your moral compass when you're creating policy. And if you have a wicked mindset, because that's why we always say mindsets matter most. No matter what you're doing, no matter what you're approaching, no matter what you're writing, no matter what you're legislating and interpreting, mindsets matter most. And you can't if you have animus towards a group of people, if you have deep racial biases towards a group of people, and then you're interpreting something, it's going to skew towards racism. It's going to do that, right? And so, to me, it's always problematic when that is the sole piece, and that certain things can be so easily overturned when you're talking about, like, justice. Things should be made better. As time goes on, things should be improved upon and made better. It should be looked at and say, you know what, like, reparations were never given. The Civil Rights Act was a step towards that. Now, years later, like, you know what, we actually don't like that, and we're going to undermine that. And anything that came out of that step towards progress, we're going to snatch it away.
They did it almost immediately. I mean, they passed the civil rights. Well, first of all, let's go back. Every time there has been Black progress made through using the Constitution, we all agree to this fiction that the Constitution is the ultimate in all historic guiding documents. And we've sucked down even the people who have been oppressed by that very document. 3/5 the person, Dred Scott, Plessy. Let's just keep going down the list. All of it was constitutional.
Treatment of Native Americans.
Slavery was constitutional, right? Non-woman suffrage was constitutional. So this idea of, like, well, the Constitution says that we should erase all of your progress that you've made, your racial progress. Well, I don't give a damn, right? Like, we're having the wrong conversation. Then if your Constitution says that colleges and universities, for the purposes of diversity, cannot take into account the fact that there are historically marginalized populations who have different degrees of marginalization into account when they're trying to create a representative body, then your Constitution is whack.
And some of the very universities, like here, and picture this, Chris, some of the universities who benefited and participated in the slave trade will now they don't have to deal with it, right? Because all of this stuff comes back to what is justice. And when Malcolm talked about the knife in the back, right, and them not even wanting to acknowledge that a knife is there, and like, what does justice actually mean? That healing part that he talked about is reparations, and reparations comes in all different forms. And the most important part of reparations to me, I think, is the education. And our kids aren't getting in pre-K to 12 grade, like, and they're not getting it now. In the you see some of the universities say, "Oh, we're still going to be committed." Like, really, you weren't really committed to it before the ruling. Now I'm supposed to expect to believe that you're going to just like now, but it's going to purify it. And I also think it's important. Like, I've heard a lot of people, and rightfully so, and I understand, like, saying like, hey, this is why we need to triple down on HBCUs. I 100% agree with that, and I don't think we should let up the fight on these other aspects of it, because a lot of that, from our labor, from our taxes, from the history of this country, you don't get to erase it. We get to choose where we want to go, but you don't get to erase us and just say like, oh, you know what? We're not going to consider the impact that we've had, both at the university institutions as well as all the surrounding, parts of the orbiting spheres also had a part to do with that. So we're not going to just walk away and ignore that either. And, the support for the HBCUs, we need to really, really take our institutions far more seriously. Even if something like this doesn't happen, we have to really pay attention to it.
I want to talk for a second about bad minorities.
Bad minorities.
Let's talk about it. Let's talk about bad minorities. So first of all, when Black people were pushing for massive changes to make America honest, America had all this marketing for years and years and years, had this marketing around democracy and freedom and all of that. During the Cold War, that came into question. And there was a need to make the United States look like the best alternative to communism. So because there was the Negro problem in the United States, there was an effort to start making some social progress in terms of legislation and laws and whatnot. And Black people fought hard to make that happen. Never did Black people judge themselves against Native Americans and say, well, we want something better than what they got, or it's not fair that you did this for them. We didn't even make it about that. We made it about what everybody should get. And because of that, every other minority group has benefited in the United States since 1964 because of what Black people did in this country and fighting for their rights. We never looked at any other group and said, you're not welcome, you're not included, we want to X you out, we want more than you. We never did any of that. But over those years, new minorities started coming in, and this is the pattern that you see with them. When the new minorities come in, they figure out the power arrangement really quickly, and then they start erring towards the powerful. Like, quickly, they assume my way to get to the top is to be as white as possible, or as close to whiteness, or as white adjacent as possible. And part of that is then I must deprioritize Black people because white people deprioritize Black people as a rule of the racial caste system. Like, as a rule, when it comes to a totem pole, a totem of racial ethnicities, Black people are at the bottom of that totem, and there's a need to keep them structurally in that place. Now, you don't have to agree with me on that. You could just read all the research and all you want, but Michelle Alexander talks about the racial bargain that was given to the Irish and to the Italians and to other minority groups. The Italians were scandalously attacked by white Americans when they first got here. They were swarthy, they were dark, they were untrustworthy. There are pictures of people with Italians and Irish people, get this, that liken them to monkeys.
Ill repute or something like that. It was like, oh, they're a person of ill repute or something. I forget the word. But
yeah, it's just like just bad. They're just bad people. They had the same stereotype. And what was given to them was a bargain. You can get provisional whiteness in Levittown. We're going to build this Levittown, and the only people who can't come are Black people. We're going to give the Polish and the Irish and the Italians, everybody who had previously been discriminated against, we're going to give you provisional whiteness. And they all accepted it. They all took it and they melded together. They intermarried. They created a new cultural norm in the United States. And the only group that couldn't do that was Black Americans. Now enter years later, Latinos and Asian immigrants that came after 1964. And what you see in a lot of them, first of all, with the Latino folks, we just already know many of them mark themselves as white on papers, right? My favorite was a white or a Latino woman in Texas whose husband got deported after Trump came in, and she had voted for Trump, and she said, "I didn't know that he was talking about us. I thought he was just talking about the bad Latinos." Like, it was the awakening of, honey, you just got provisional whiteness. You're still on probation. Chill out. Right. And the same thing with Asian Americans. They are now getting provisional whiteness because whiteness needs to continuously refeed itself. It needs to create, it's losing its own population. It's dwindling. So what it has always done is, okay, well, we better let in the Italians. We better let in the Jews. We better let in, they just started letting in other groups. And now they're running out of groups to let in because they still hate the gays and the blacks and the immigrants, by the way. But anyways, does that make sense, Sharif? Like we have to talk about minority Olympics a little bit because they take the racial bargain. Many of them come here and take that bargain right away.
Yeah, and you know, and I wish it was something where they were coming here and people were coming here and being reprogrammed to be anti-Black, but unfortunately, that's an international phenomena that's been marketed and honed, and through Hollywood, through media, through the military, through politics, so this anti-Black fervor, while people may sign on the dotted line once they get here, that's often part of people's culture from where whence they come, and we can see that in their own communities and cultures. There's a propensity to have hatred towards darker hued people, even amongst their own kind, let alone people of African descent, let alone not just the continent, but the continent's children. And so that's, and I've seen that both internationally as well as when I see it here from an international community, right? And so here is the opportunity to do it a little bit differently. But it has roots. It's for many folks. It's not the first time that they tasted, oh, this is what anti-Black can feel like. It actually makes me feel good. I feel better about myself. I actually, you know what? I could do this. I can actually do this.
I could do this.
What? And so they, they probably get more practice, more at bats, as they say here. But unfortunately, it's not a new thing in too many cultures internationally, and that is because of often how Europe has not only described but undermined the continent as well as the diaspora.
Yeah,
in so many different ways.
Here's something.
Because why are Nigerians the model minority?
That you got to ask yourself.
So the Nigerians I see, they were like, we everywhere, right? Like the ones in Philly, they were like, we everywhere, no matter what. Like,
right.
Success here, Nigerian, right? Like, it's a large country, right? And their diaspora is also large.
As a group, they're doing better than Asians here. As a group, when they come to the United States, they're doing better than many of the Asians, and they're not seen as the model minority.
Why?
I don't know. Maybe there's this thing called anti-Blackness. And we didn't invent it. This is what I want to say to America and everybody else. You could be as tired as you want to be about listening to this. You could be as tired as you want to be about listening to Black people. You can be as tired as you want to be about claims of racism. You could be as, desirous of having the freedom to not have to hear about it, or not to hear divisive concepts, or to not have your children ever encounter an idea that they don't like or whatnot. You could try and live in your perfectly protected white bubble all you want. That history's not on your side, but the future's not on your side either. So you have two sides of you that are playing against you. History is playing against you because the unfinished business of the United States is going to still be unfinished business until it's finished. Meaning people are not going to stop wanting their rights. People are not going to stop fighting for what is theirs, and reparations, right? And the future is against you because your numbers are changing, right? The whole world is changing in terms of color, and you're not on the right side of that either. So what you have to do is increasingly more desperate and crazy tactics to be the new South Africa, to maintain power over the many. You have to do more crazy and crazy things that dehumanize you more than us. It dehumanizes you to have to be that anti-human. If you look at your echo chambers, and I'm talking to you, white America, your echo chambers are so full of hate and divisiveness and scapegoating and constantly finding a group to marginalize and bully. That's a bad fuel. I feel bad for you to have to live in that every day, to have to live in the fact of seeing boogeymen in every corner, and you're the only victim, right? You're the only you're the only one that's victimized, not the people you're victimizing. I feel sorry for you if you think that that's a long-term way of living and being. It's definitely not going to be good for your grandchildren, right? So if you're one of those people who just thinks about today, I'm just warning you. This is not the way that a peaceful world and a good country is going to come about. So that the future's not on your side either. But I want to use this one example of Vivek. I don't know if I'm saying his name right. Asian American running for president on the most kind of like, I'm Trumper than thou. I'm to the right of the right. Like, the right is not right enough for me. And, he's a fast talking, smooth looking, good product in the hair, fresh suit, blah, 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 Asian American who is saying, I want to get rid of birthright citizenship. This is his newest one, right? First, he wanted to take away the right to vote until you are 21 years old or until you've earned it.
I want to move it to 16. He wants to move it to
he wants to move it to 21, and then he wants to make it dependent on you earning it, meaning you have to pass citizenship tests and all these other things.
He learned well. He learned well,
right? And now he's
another
saying,
group that used to do that.
See, and this is my point. When Bobby Jindal in Louisiana was running as an Indian American governor, gubernatorial candidate, he ran radio ads that didn't show his face on purpose, and he did the Southern drawl in those radio ads on purpose.
Are you serious?
Yes, and he did it on purpose because he knew that too much visibility, especially in the outback of Louisiana, would not get him elected. So he did this more Republican than thou thing. He did this, I'm going to be whiter than white. He did that whole thing and he won. And he was, a relatively good governor, people should say. But Vivek now is like part 2 of that, part 3. He's like Dinesh D'Souza, like part 15. This guy comes to the United States with 2 parents that are both college-educated professionals. He's born on third base. He comes to the United States, doesn't have to buy into the country, doesn't have to pay anything to come into a great country and get elevated quickly. All he has to do is do anti-Blackness better than everybody else, and he thinks that this is going to give him the edge of all edges in running for president. All it's doing is giving him a platform to say the craziest things about everybody else. And he's got he's polling at 3%, right? It's not really catching on. But this last one, wanting to get rid of birthright citizenship, right? To me, these things are so offensive to the values of the United States. And you're talking about a guy who's been here 5 minutes and he knows everything. He knows everything about Black history. He got on CNN and lectured Don Lemon about how he should feel about
this is the guy.
This is the guy. Right.
Well, he knows how to capitalize and revere founding fathers. So like that, he's passed the citizenship test. He's like, oh, our founding father. They like pass. Like you're good.
You're in.
Our founding fathers.
Envisioned. And he will say
Do
that.
we really want to implement what the founding fathers envisioned in this country? Are you freaking out of your mind?
They envisioned 3/5 a person. Right. It's not a mystery to me. Our founding fathers. No, those are your founding fathers.
They're our founding oppressors.
And
our
if we're being real,
tyrants.
those were not your fathers either, because you were in the Irish and you were in all these other groups. Right. Thus Shays Rebellion. So anyways, this is my point. It is apparent to me that what I just said about Vivek is actually an endemic thing with immigrants. They come here, they recognize that anti-Blackness is part of their ascension. And they realize that it's a very powerful tool. I just recently saw a video 2 or 3 days ago, an Asian family, and I think it's California, cussing out the Latino housekeepers that were coming to clean a house. What are you doing in our neighborhood? We live here. We pay to live here. What are you doing here? Show us proof that you belong here. We get to stop you. We get to say whether or not you can come here because we live here and blah, blah, blah. So the white neighbor who employs them comes out, and the white neighbor comes out and takes the Asian Americans family side against the Latino side and tells the Latino workers that she's hiring, you got to go. You got to go home, blah, 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 blah. To which later she tried to bring them back and have them clean her house again. But in the moment on video, you see an Asian American couple doing very much what Karen white people do to another group, to another minority group. And that to me is so endemic of it's so symbolic of what I think lots of immigrants actually learn when they come here. They look at the power dynamic, they see who's where and who's on top, and they know who they want their kids to be, and they know who their kids do not want to be, and they act accordingly. Now, does that feel too harsh?
No, I mean it doesn't, and I would also, I think color in the lines a bit where you also mentioned that the majority of Asians understand that affirmative action has not been realized and needs to continue to be supported. And I would imagine there's something similar. It's interesting, like when we see things, and that just sounds, really horrible. And I can't help but to think about the idea of 69%.
69% registered Asian American voters support affirmative action. It's particularly high in Korean, Indian, and Asians overall. It's even with on the bottom Chinese, it's at almost 60%. The group that opposes within the Asian American community is a minority group. But continue. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to
no. Thank you for that. I can't help but to think about like the original Rainbow Coalition with Fred Hampton and like how people recognize like all of our fates are really tied together, and it's against this idea of white supremacy, where those, that coalition, that Rainbow Coalition in some ways is, the white supremacy is being injected. Like if white supremacy is on the defense, it's going to know how to reshape it. It's a shift shaper. Shapeshifter. What are those Marvel comic dudes? They can right? Shapeshifters, right? Whatever. But that, like, for those who aren't familiar with Marvel, these beings can change their presentation. They can show up in different ways. They can show up and turn into different things. And that's how, like, if racism was a thing, it would be that, right? And it's like, oh, all right, well, how do y'all banding together? Let me see what threads I can pull to unravel this. What bomb can I drop into the conversation? What fly can I throw in your milk? Like that, just to get, less, more divisiveness, more mistrust, misunderstanding. And I think when intelligent people see, here's the history and here's the legacy of the history and here's how it shows up, they may need help understand, like, okay, this is what it looks like today. You can't help but to say, like, wait a minute, there's something inherently wrong with this. And that ship never really landed in a totally new dock. It's still on the original journey. And it may have like made some shifts, but it's never gotten to this place that people are just like, oh yeah, now everything is race neutral. Everyone is like, because you can't get to neutrality in racial conditions until you address the trajectory that you started. The path that was originally taken was never fully addressed. And so without that, whether it's education, whether it's housing, whether it's law, whether it's economics, it continues on the same pattern. A force in motion stays in motion. A force of racism will stay racist. It will stay on that path. It stays on that orbit. And it's like, it's not that hard to understand unless you're choosing to say, well, you know what? As you said, like, I'm tired of dealing with it. I don't have the courage to deal with it. Or to fix it means that I have to, in some kind of way, have less than. Those are the only, like, those are like in my head, like the main blockages for people to really see, like, wait a minute, if you've created these ghettos, if you won't give business loan. Wells Fargo gave out, they took like what, $100 million fine when they said like, oh yeah, we've been discriminating against Black people. Slap us on the wrist. All right, yeah, we'll pay the fine of millions of dollars. Like, it wasn't no like 1, 2, 3 million. It was millions of dollars in fines, and yet it persists. Right? Like, there's a reason for that kind of thing. If that's like one of the largest banks institutions can do something like that. And so I do agree that individually, yes, there are a lot of folks who continue to support this idea of reparations and affirmative action and trying to make things better. But the folks who are in policy and with the loudest voices, and we'll get those same think tanks that you mentioned, the same think tanks who are against this affirmative action space and funding all of that. If you peel it back, they're probably right behind the anti-CRT stuff. They're all cousins, right? They're all at the same table.
And what they are defending, I think, is they're defending against ever having to make a rightful settlement with Black people. The United States has never made a good settlement. We have had a claim, and Dr. King talked about this claim at the March on Washington. Like, we have come with a check that has insufficient funds, right? The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was not the settlement for more than a century of kind of exclusion, and then centuries before that of enslavement. That generated trillions of dollars worth of capital in the United States that actually jump-started the country. So when everybody talks about the founding fathers didn't work. I just want to be very clear with you. Founding fathers didn't work. They sat around putting perfume on to get rid of their funk and sitting in powdered wigs and shit, right?
Wigs.
So your powdered wig families, which by the way is drag. Let's just be clear. So the nation was started by drag queens. Let's just be real about this. Like, if I showed up anywhere today dressed like Thomas Jefferson, they would call me a drag queen. So Drag Story Hour started actually at the founding of the country. So trillions of dollars worth of investment. I know. You got to do it. Somebody's got to do it, right?
It's not a library. It's in the Constitutional Hall in Philadelphia.
It's like, oh my God, I can't see the drag people. They just came about today. You can't? Have you seen the old pictures of the Constitutional Convention? What do you think that was? Every one of them looked like they were a backup dancer for Madonna. Like, Vogue, yeah, shit. What is wrong with you people? Anyways, so trillions of dollars of investment. African Americans contributed trillions of dollars to the starting of this country. And then what I want to say about this is everybody who tells me, well, I wasn't even here and I didn't own slaves. No, you weren't here. See, you came after that and you benefited from a fully developed economy that was developed because of the labor of Black people, the blood, sweat, tears, maiming, deaths, rapes, and everything else that it took to get this country started. And there has never been a class action lawsuit that created a reparative payment for that. So to have new people come here and be here 5 minutes and then say, oh yeah, but I don't think Black history matters anymore. I get the greed. I get the wanting to ascend faster than everybody else. But see what the dominant old founding fathers and their population are doing and their descendants are doing is they're trying to evade repayment. They're constantly, so all of these think tanks, all of this research, all of these, efforts to strike down any racial balance, any addressing of the Black issue. Listen, they didn't even want Clinton to apologize as the president for slavery, right? Presidents all around the country have apologized for the Holocaust and for slavery in their countries and other things. When Clinton was going to make an apology to Black Americans, that was even a bridge too far. That's how niggardly the white population of the United States has been to Black people. So stingy. They don't even want us to have the little bit that we have.
And for those who didn't connect the context clues, niggardly means stingy, like
stingy. Yes.
I remember one time on the A Black Hands podcast, one of our fellow members was like, "You just said the N-word," and I was like, "Oh my gosh!" Like, no, that's not what.
So I think what happens when you have an unpaid bill? Collections keeps coming for you. And then they sell your debt to another collection company and they keep coming for you. So if you think you're going to generation yourself out of ever having to make real payment to this, you're not. So as long as there's black breath in the United States, as long as there's a black body with a mind that breathes, there's going to be talk of what you need to do to rectify the fact that Black people in every area of life activity are still discriminated against, by the way, in mortgages and mortgage loans and all of these things. Listen, the reason you have so many Asian businesses in Black communities is because Black people couldn't get access to capital. Right? Asian people could get access to capital. Well, how could they get access to capital? Well, they could do it a couple of different ways. Number one, the banks weren't treating Asian Americans the same way that they were treating Black folks. So when it came to getting capital, that's the first thing. The second thing is the Asian Americans who were coming here, actually, many of them were coming here with more education than the people who were here already. And they were creating co-ethnic communities. They had co-ethnic communities, meaning some poor Asians could come here and some better off Asians, but they would be in a closed economy with themselves that worked very well. It's a very successful model, and people should look at it. That gave them access to capital wherever they were on the spectrum. So when we talk about the hardworking, super smart Asian student not getting a seat at Harvard, which, by the way, Harvard only lets in like 2% of its applicants, right? 50,000 applicants for almost no seats in the place there, in the college there. We're comparing that Asian kid because they're hardworking and their culture just tells them to, whatever, they're amazing. And the Black, not hardworking person. Now, so let's talk about this for 1 second. Harvard looks at 11 different factors. One of those 11 factors is race and your background, like with the idea that maybe you overcame something to get to that place. So Black applicants are making it through those other factors, right? And you have this one other group over here saying, yeah, but our test scores are higher. So we only want you to look at this one factor. We don't want you to look at all the other 11 factors, of which you might be failing at some of those others because you're going to tutoring for test prep on a regular basis more than anybody else because your family and your community is driven by you getting into Harvard, and they think the test score is the only way to do it, and it's not. There are these other 10 factors of which these other Black kids and Latino kids and everybody else is making it through. We're having a weird conversation, unbalanced conversation about who gets in.
And then add to that, Chris, if you can, about the whole legacy. So, like, even with all of these, legacy admissions actually take up a significant amount of spots. But the narrative will be blame that Black person, blame that brown person, but not blame the WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant who's been there for hundreds of years and have these legacy spots, right? And I also want to just really challenge the heart, and not to say that, listen, every group that, intelligence and all that is not on this bell curve. It is evenly distributed. It is in every zip code. Even the poorest zip code has brilliance. But sometimes when I hear, these people, I hear white people say, well, that minority works so hard. I'm just like, you know what? Nobody actually works harder than successful Black people in this country. The amount of things that they have to overcome in this country for hundreds of years, right? Like Native Americans, Black folk, right? Like there's groups of folks who've overcome generational and policies that were distinctly written, not one or two or three, not 10 or 15 or hundreds and hundreds, thousands, I would say, of policies that were distinctly written to undermine, marginalize, if not outright kill groups of people. And for them to overcome that, to me, is like, and to ignore that. And not to say, and again, I'm not saying don't call Asians hardworking. I'm saying stop calling one group of people hardworking because it doesn't make sense. I can show you, like, being working in schools for 26 years, knowing some of the elementary schools that some of these kids would come through, the pre-K that didn't exist for some of them, the daycares that didn't exist for some of them, and they came through that. They came through mass incarceration. They came through, the red line. They came through all of that to make it to a certain point. It took some hard work. Those were, but the narrative will say, oh, they got the hand. You worked hard, and this group got the handout. and
Mhm.
I'm calling BS on it again, like so many other folks.
You
But the
know,
legacy piece, I think, also misses out on. I worked hard. Like, no, blame the blame the white people who took this pot. Why, we got like 3 seats, and you're like, hey, you didn't deserve those 3 seats. You should have 1 or 0 every other year, not every year. Like, get 1 seat every other year, and then things are or be equitable. Like, so when people say like, oh, that's discriminating against Asians, and no mention of to me that is like, that is sinister, not almost sinister, that is absolutely a sinister narrative.
and we should talk about quickly data points. We should just be clear that, we're not just talking out of pocket. So if you look at who's getting into Harvard, 15% African American, almost 28% of Asian American, almost 13% of Hispanic Latino, only 3% of Native Americans, and not even 1% of Native Hawaiians are getting into Harvard. And that is with 50,000 people applying, where only 2% of them or so are going to get in. What is more than all of these percentages is legacy. Legacy admission is almost a third of the admissions, right? So that's the affirmative action for white people, for white, historically wealthy people, people who can buy a building for Harvard or could do something, get their name on something, or who graduated from Harvard when Harvard was still racially isolating people. That's the group of legacy. So 28%, more than all these other racial categories, that one white affirmative action program is actually more than all of these others, right? Let's start there. Secondly, 70 something percent of that 28% of them, 70 something percent of them, which means 2/3 of them would not actually qualify to get into Harvard if it wasn't
That
for
part.
legacy. If it wasn't
That
for
part.
legacy,
Repeat that, please.
right? So 70% of that third of people that get in under the white affirmative action program to Harvard would not qualify to get in were it not for their legacy status, their status as legacies. So what they are artfully doing, wealthy families who are funding these cases, what they are artfully doing is saying, we're going to get those other groups to fight each other. So they're going to tell the Asians that it's the blacks, right? The Asian population is about 6%, I think, in the United States, and their entrance to Harvard is like 28%. If that's discrimination, I think all the other groups need to be discriminated against, right? Because if you are getting 5 times your population as a rate into a thing, and you're saying that you're being discriminated against, African Americans are getting exactly the same percentage of the that they are in the United States, about 15% or so. That's about what we are in the United States, and that's about what their admission is to Harvard. That seems pretty level to me, right? If it's unlevel for anybody, it's probably Native Americans and Hawaiians. But I'm not saying this to play the kind of racial Olympics. I'm only saying you should look at the data points and wonder, why are we fighting each other about this? And why did we fall for this so easily when there's this other affirmative action, race-based affirmative action program? Because very likely you can say it's indirectly. Well, they're not all white, or it didn't, it's the legacy isn't just for white people. It doesn't say white, right? Like, Americans are so stupid. They need things to be explicitly said for them to believe that it exists, right? At the same time that they're teaching their kids about Santa Claus and a damn bunny, it has something to do with Christ on Easter. I don't know what this is. Like, we can sell illusions to our people.
That's American ingenuity, bro.
That really is. That is real. To
Ford,
sell a story that don't make no
Chrysler,
damn sense.
And what is it? Easter eggs from a bunny.
Easter eggs from a bunny having something to do with Christ is the part that I just don't get. I'm like, every Easter, I'm kind of like, why are we selling this story? But it just tells me the level of what we will participate in terms of illusions within this country, and we keep doing it. One other data point I want to go back to, because people are going to challenge me on this, and I just want to make sure that I show you that I'm not making it up. If you look at this graph right here, this is the increasing share of U.S. immigrants who have a bachelor's degree or higher, right? From 1960, it was about 2.5%, and today, it's as high as 17%. And the postgraduate rate is going up in all of that time, right? Who this isn't going up for necessarily are the Black people that are being excluded at the same time from many of the opportunities in the United States. But the reason for this increase is because the United States is increasingly selecting people from other countries that, when they let them in, are better educated, because they want to make sure that they're not just open borders and just letting all the people of color in. It's very racist. If you look at this table, it shows you what part and which Asian countries and which countries are actually coming the most educated, right? This is important because we have to stop talking about like we're talking apples to apples. Well, this Asian kid didn't get in because of this black kid. They have completely different situations going on. They have different communities. They have different stories. They have different backgrounds. So it takes a large degree of white supremacy to just like meld everybody together and say, it's like the racial Olympics. They want us to be in contest with each other so that we don't look at things like the white affirmative action program at Harvard, right? The American kind of like America, it's not just at Harvard. America has a white affirmative action program, right? Do you think that any of Trump's appointees, if you look at his appointees, very white, do you think any of his appointees had the qualifications for the things he put them in charge of? He made a blogger a judge. Right? Do you think, get your mind around that stuff? Did Stephen Miller really qualify for a job? Did any of those bobbleheads that he had all around him at the very high level, did any of them have the qualifications? No one ever asked the question. No one ever asked the question. Nobody ever said anything about. And I think we need to start fighting back on meritocracy is a joke. American meritocracy is based on a lie. And I would love for us to be able to say all the rules are fair. And if you didn't make it and you didn't succeed, it's just because you didn't make the very fair bar. But that's not the way that it is. I'll give you the last word on this because I feel like that's my rant. And
no, and I think that history, and I hope, Josh is putting all of those, links in the general chat room as well, because I think it's, I love shows like this where it gives people not only things to think about, but things to read and think about even more and deeper. And, one day I told myself I wanted to write a book, a children's book, though, like something is for adults, but it's written at a childlike language so that it's accessible to everybody, even for people, and not from like an intellect thing, but from busy and distracted kind of like where like, oh, anybody can get through this. And it's just going to tell a story of a family who decides to like confront racism, but they do it in this different way. They want to sell their house. They understand that this is, part of building capital and building wealth to pass on to, generations. And they put all pictures of white people up in their house to make sure that things are happening. When they want to apply for a loan, they change their name and make sure it's not too Black or ethnic sounding. If they want to get to a good school, they use an address in a place that they had been redlined out of. Their grandparents had been redlined out of, but they use an address in that realm, in that space, even though they don't live there, right? And they just will tell a very, very different story than someone who maintains who they are and is oblivious to all the rules of like what's actually going to happen. And then they do that. In their Harvard application, they lie and say I'm the child of so-and-so. You just named that lab after them. And so I deserve to be there, even though the grades may be middling at best. So all of these, right? Like all of this stuff. And I gotta, get the right, illustrator and everything just to make it pop. But I want to do that just to kind of share like America the Beautiful. That's what it's going to be called, America the Beautiful. And underneath that beauty, underneath that veneer is just going to be a shit show.
And I actually will buy copies of this book and I will read it and I probably will disseminate it to many people, because I think it's a book that needs to be written. We need to talk about the illusion of America, but we also need to, and I think this is where we should land on. we need to talk about the possibility of America, because the thing that Black people, the thing that gave us hope and kept us fighting was not fighting for our rights. It was the belief that we could be a more perfect country. It was the belief that we could be good. Because if we didn't believe it, we wouldn't have fought for it. We would have fought differently. Our fights would be different if we actually didn't believe that America could be great. When Black people came to America multiple times to say we need to change these laws, they changed them for everybody. They gave everybody freedom. Those laws were meant to make America better and make America actually live up to its promise. And I think we still have that potential now today. I think we still have the potential to fight for the nation that we want, a well-functioning, multiracial democracy where nobody feels marginalized or outcast, and we don't do scapegoating. We actually know right away when we hear people try to marginalize any group, we know right away it doesn't have to be us. We know right away what that means, and we just stamp it out, because we want a country that actually, more than anything, invents a way for a pluralistic country to negotiate its differences on a regular basis and find peace. That's the big dream. That's the goal.
We need to figure out how in Germany, you know, how you can't say anything anti-Semitic in Germany, right? Like it is absolutely, like, as a society, right? You know, and of course you have folks there pushing back too, right? Like you have a minority very loud that just says, "Oh, we should be able to say
Free
that
speech.
and do that and all that," right? Like all this kind of thing. Like, you know, we need a similar type of reckoning for anti-Black language, behavior, policy, because if it happens for anti-Black mindsets and stance postures is like banned, it's going to support and help all of humanity.
Yeah.
Like that's the thing about it. Like that's the thing. Like you keep trying to improve, but as long as you keep this anti-Blackness as your base, right? Like it's other, like, so if a friend of mine, we're making like yogurt, Khmer yogurt, like on our own, right? You keep this culture. So this brother I met, he's kept this yogurt culture, these live, active. Everybody wants probiotic, but it's made in the factory, John. He's been curating this culture for 35 years.
Wow.
And
Damn,
all you need,
what?
35 years, because you just keep adding, you know, putting it in another thing of milk, and then that turns to yogurt, right? It's the easiest way to make yogurt, right? Like in Iran, when we were growing up, they would boil the milk and all that. Like it was a long process. An easier way is to take the culture and just add it to anything. So that add it to milk, and then it'll, you know, turn to yogurt, you know, in a day or two. He's been doing that for 35 years, right? And so it reminded me when he was, you know, walking folks through the process, and I got some, you know, already made, like, you know, 3 batches of yogurt. You know how I am, bro. I'll send you some. You know,
no, you don't need to send me none. Do not send me that. I will report you to the police if you send that to me. I don't want any food that is 35 years old. I don't care what it is.
So you know, honey.
It sounds good.
So you some eggs and see some yogurt culture, right? It's just like sustainable living, bro. You in Minnesota, bro. Like that's the life. But you know, just point. Adding that, like, right, like they keep adding a little anti-Blackness to however they're thinking. That means, you know, we were talking on Twitter today about Neely Fuller, about his comment, like, if you don't understand racism and white supremacy, everything you do understand is going to confuse you. And that's what I feel is we're in these spaces where people don't quite understand racism, or choosing to feign obliviousness about it, right? And that means all the other work. It's that hex from Color Purple. Everything you touch is still going to be corrupt because you haven't dealt with the original sin.
I think that's a great place to stop. Deal with the original sin. Stop pitting people against each other. Asian Americans and African Americans are not enemies. They're allies. This show is not about competition. It's about cooperation. And it's about truth telling. If you're an Asian person who has listened to this show and you have anything to say about it, please actually send me a note at chris@citizenstewart.com. And also, if you want the show notes from today, I will send them to you, anyone. So shoot me an email at chris@citizenstewart.com, and I'll shoot you the show notes from today, which has some of the, just not a ton, but a lot of the research that we talked about today is in those show notes. And also, we are very welcome. We both, Sharif and I, have Asian American friends that we would love to bring on. If anybody wants to come on Freedom Friday show and talk about this further, we should do it, because I think it's not an issue that's going to end. It's not something we're going to keep getting pitted against each other, and we should stop doing that. I believe we can have a better country. We really can, but we need to have these conversations.
And one example, and I know we got a tiny example of like what coalitions look like. I mentioned to you before, in Philadelphia, they want to build this new Sixers unit stadium, downtown Philly, which is right adjacent to Chinatown. One of the oldest, and living right, like Chinatown in Philly and some other places. From my understanding, some places just stores, right? But here it's like people living there, and there are schools there and things like that. And when you see the coalition of people who are like pushing back, it is a rainbow coalition of people saying like, no, don't. This will have a negative impact on the cost of living, quality of life in Chinatown. And it's not just Asians who are there saying like, no, this is a bad idea, right? Like, and we need more of that in all the different spheres and spaces. And so, may the Rainbow Coalition, continue to come together, and Fred Hampton and other people. He wasn't the only one. Other people's vision for what this could and should look like to improve this country, and hold it accountable for human rights.
I love that. This has been another episode of Freedom Friday with Sharif El-Mekki and me. You are still not free, but hopefully you're freer after this conversation, and you will return next Friday for another Freedom Friday. Same time, same place. Share it with your friends. Give it as a gift. It's a great gift. Send it to all your family members and tell them, this is in lieu of Christmas presents this year. I'm going to give you something that's going to educate you. We appreciate you all, as always, for spending your time. You could do anything at this time on a Friday, so we really appreciate you being here with us. We'll see you next week.